Hello, I am Brett Lansdell, a shareholder in Elliott Davis's private equity practice. We are continuing our multi-part management consulting video series titled Operational Discussion. This series focuses on the manufacturing and distribution space and has produced some really great content thus far, including growing the top line, improving operational performance, and building a more resilient supply chain. Today, we have the 10th installment, which is titled Managing a Merger and Acquisition. The next and last two installments of the series will be change management and risk management. It is our view that every company should have a well-articulated value creation strategy. And one way to advance this strategy is through successful mergers and acquisitions. Today, I am joined by Stephen Lin. He's a director in our management consulting practice and has experience and insights into this topic. With that, I want to flip it over to Stephen for a quick intro, and then we'll jump right into it.
Thanks, Brett. I'm Stephen Lin, and I'm part of our management consulting team at Elliott Davis. Previously, I worked in the strategy consulting group at KPMG. And at Elliott Davis, our group helps clients in areas like growth strategy, operational transformation, and M&A, which is today's topic. So I've worked on numerous M&A projects in the manufacturing, banking, and other spaces, particularly in the area of post-close integration and optimization.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, so let's just start with the basics here. What are you seeing as the driving force behind a merger and acquisition strategy and the acquisition of companies?
Well, that's a good question. I might just take a step back to start, and I don't think that companies really think of M&A enough as a strategic option, and this is probably because they often fail to link M&A to their strategic plan. These strategies are often real near-term focused, and they aren't really contemplating major like industry or environmental changes. But cut to our new COVID environment, and maybe companies are starting to consider M&A opportunities when it wasn't previously on their radar.
Yeah, Stephen, I think those are all good points. I mean, some of the things that we certainly see out there in the private equity space would be, to improve company performance, could be kind of excess capacity, could be to create, market access for products. Could be skills, technologies, a lot of things, but that's all good stuff. I do want to dig a little bit deeper into the rationale to acquire companies, and want to make sure kind of our audience takes away just some nuggets to think about, in terms of when an acquisition may make sense.
Sure. I think a few examples of when it might make sense would be if you're looking to achieve quick growth in a new geographic location, for instance, or maybe you want to acquire some intellectual property that you can't grow or you can't grow quickly. You could be trying to fill a gap in your product portfolio. For instance, Amazon bought Whole Foods in part because Whole Foods suburban and urban locations are very valuable as distribution hubs. It's not just because they wanted to enter the grocery store market. Another example, I helped a client. It was a large southeastern packaging company on an acquisition project, and they were buying a German packaging company. This was strategic for them not only because it expanded their European footprint, but also because the German company had innovative R&D capabilities the U.S. company just didn't have, and it would have taken them a long time to grow those capabilities organically.
Yeah, Steve, that all makes sense. I mean, I think kind of the gist of that, right, is there's probably a lot of different reasons in terms of why an acquisition may make sense. Before we jump into some more, acquisition, merger-related matters, I do want to kind of take a step back and just talk a little bit about kind of the private equity landscape. And speaking broadly about private companies and investors, most of us had an optimistic outlook for 2020, and now we're all dealing with the challenges on multiple fronts of COVID. And while we definitely saw private equity-backed companies react more aggressively to the pandemic, and as a result were hit less hard, we definitely did see deals being put on hold or kind of taking a little bit of a pause before we really started seeing them kind of come back in recent weeks. And I think what we do know is that market disruptions can create opportunities. And so, for investors looking at new deals, there is some level of expectation that valuations will materially decline, unless, of course, maybe that target has been neutral to positively impacted by COVID. But make no mistake about it, that deal activity in the middle market has slowed. PitchBook came out and said that, private equity groups are sitting on something like $740 billion in dry powder. And that has to be put to work. And that could be through traditional buyouts or, some alternative use. Now, in the manufacturing and distribution space, we are seeing companies taking, a defensive or offensive position, and portfolio companies, almost all of them, tap some level of capital reserves really to kind of shore up the balance sheet and preserve cash. In the short term, we saw a shift from, what would be kind of a traditional buy and build strategy to really kind of boosting operational efficiencies. And then, if I think about the long term, COVID has really kind of fast tracked the need to diversify revenue and supply chains, really out of necessity.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think part of what you said there sort of reiterates what we talked about above and what we've been telling our clients, which is M&A should be a tool that's considered. It's not right for everyone, but as you mentioned, there's alternatives too. It's not just traditional buyouts, but it could be a minority positions as well.
Stephen, I read a study recently that's put out by the Exit Planning Institute, and it showed that 66% of current American businesses are owned by baby boomers who are set to transition over the next 0 to 10 years. And so, while only 20 to 30% of those may actually sell when they go to market, there's no doubt that there is a silver tsunami on its way. And, while that silver tsunami will create opportunities, we know that, for certain. We also know that not all mergers and acquisitions will be successful. Stephen, can you talk to me, a little bit about the risks that come along with mergers and acquisitions, outside of like the traditional quality of earnings assessment, and maybe talk a little bit about, how to uncover, some of those landmines?
Sure. I mean, and absolutely, you're right. It's a huge risk. I think I read, according to the Harvard Business Review, between 70 and 90% of mergers and acquisitions fail, which is pretty staggering statistic. So I think due diligence, and not just the financial that you mentioned, but also commercial diligence, is essential to gain more insights into the potential risks and the anticipated benefits of a transaction. So, like I say, the standard due diligence, that's almost always performed, but more and more, we're seeing some amount of commercial diligence being performed, even for the smaller deal sizes. So even if this is just some piece of what we might consider a comprehensive commercial due diligence assessment, I mean, for example, maybe a company's just doing a targeted assessment of capabilities and leadership depth, or maybe they're just doing a customer diversity analysis, but they're doing something where they weren't necessarily before.
Yeah, Stephen, I mean, I mentioned that in recent weeks, we've seen the deal activity picked up. And I mean, there's no doubt, right, that when you think about diligence, the companies are looking more towards forecasts and trying to understand the assumptions there. And, really the goal in this environment is to try to quantify as much as possible. Investors definitely want to find kind of those landmines right during the diligence process, as opposed to trying to manage them through the back end. Stephen, you know, my day-to-day revolves around deals, and I know that this may not be true for our audience here, but I think it's important to recognize that the real work of a merger and acquisition starts with the closing of the transaction. There's a saying that anybody can go buy a company, but not everybody can go and create something special and create value. And so the focus turns pretty quickly to needs and opportunities and strategic demands for continuity and change in the newly owned business. Can you talk to me about some of the most important ingredients for successful mergers and acquisitions?
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's still plenty of hard work to be done after the deal closes. So, I mean, even if you've gone through a pretty thorough due diligence process, you'll need to plan rigorously. And then you'll need to carefully execute on that plan to realize the values and avoid those landmines we talked about that you identified during diligence. So this could go on long after the deal closes. So hopefully you have the luxury of performing some implementation planning prior to closing, where you identify major success drivers along each functional area. But in all honesty, this planning is sometimes inhibited by a lack of access to people and information at the acquiree prior to close. And we're often brought in just before close or even after the deal closes.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, yeah, I mean, that's good. That's insightful. But if we take the ingredients a step further and state, I think it's fair to do so that buyers expect businesses will do well based on how they value them. Sometimes success is less about integration and more about execution, and execution is often, or maybe, always easier said than done. Can you give our audience some thoughts about, how you would take, pre and post close strategies and then execute on them to increase the likelihood of a successful deal?
Sure. Yeah. And I think it's worth reiterating what we said, thorough due diligence and planning can ensure success. You really have to execute. And for us, post-close work often starts with some sort of strategic planning exercises with our clients where we're going to ask questions like, what do we see as opportunities for our business? What markets do we want to pursue? Do we have the right capabilities and the right leadership to execute on our strategy? What projects in our portfolio do we want to prioritize or deprioritize? And what capital needs to be deployed, and how should we do that? And then there's the implementation of those plans or actions that come out of those strategic planning exercises. So you have to execute on the plans that you carefully developed. And these activities should probably be managed as a discrete project. And what I mean by that is this work is not really business as usual, the post-close work. And so project members have to be able to be dedicated to making this a success, and there must be good, sufficient management attention to the deal. And this focus is going to be pretty intense for at least the first 90 days and possibly much longer. You should have already identified your expected synergies as well as other areas of risks. And now you need to set up the infrastructure to realize those synergies. So you're going to, track the defined success metrics that you've already identified. Maybe that's retaining employees, maybe it's operational savings, et cetera. You're gonna develop and manage post-close activities with a robust project plan. We talked about that in one of our previous videos around project management, but having owners and due dates may sound like an obvious thing, but that rigorous management of the project is key. One of the big ones too is executing on a communication plan that was developed. This is essential for keeping employees and customers and other stakeholders informed. And I think this close attention to post-close execution will likely be particularly important in the COVID and post-COVID era. I mean, one, because companies want to be stringent about realizing all of this identified value from a merger or acquisition when resources are pretty constrained, but also because COVID may present some new challenges or considerations into the picture.
Yeah, Stephen, those are all good points. And, we see it all the time that, two really important factors is talent, leadership. And there's a lot of changes that happen upon a merger acquisition, kind of on both fronts. And it's, making sure that you have the right talent, the right leadership, and then you're also kind of identifying the lifeblood of that company in that target and make sure you kind of have that buy-in. That kind of all dovetails into the communication strategy that you talked about earlier. Stephen, there are all kinds of examples out there about deals going wrong. And I want to open up the conversation a little bit about some of the common pitfalls and, what a successful deal actually looks like. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think firstly, maybe trying to manage through the deal on the back end, like you mentioned previously, rather than more methodically plotting through the due diligence and planning execution is one of the big pitfalls that we see.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably give you several examples, Stephen, but when we think about kind of a roll-up strategy, we think about process, procedures, and operations, is that sometimes the strategy is kind of a buy and build strategy, but at some point you really got to kind of turn back the focus to process, procedures, and operations and make sure you have that integration in place before you continue moving forward too fast.
Yeah, exactly. Other pitfalls that I might mention would be not identifying the appropriate measurable success metrics that we talked about and the targets. In other words, if you fail to define what success looks like in a very concrete way, or if you fail to track those metrics rigorously once you close, it could mean you're not going to realize some of the value. Failing to establish a process to ensure that all significant customer and associate impacts are identified and mitigated is another one. You want to be able to anticipate where those areas are going to be. In the case of an integration, not taking softer aspects into account. The deal I mentioned earlier, where a Southern packaging company was buying a German competitor, they found several differences between the two organizations when we did a cultural assessment that could cause friction. I mean, things like the buyer had a very flat organization, managerial layers were often bypassed. There was a real open door sort of come on in style. And this really conflicted with a German company that was much more hierarchical and would have bristled at that type of management. The US company had a much more disciplined, risk-averse, short-term ROI orientation, whereas the German company often made investments based on gut feeling and trust. So these sort of cultural and other norms had to be discussed and a plan put in place to monitor during implementation. And employee satisfaction was surveyed 6 months after close to sort of gauge the feelings around the transition. Retaining their top talent was key, so they had to pay attention to that. Another pitfall might be, just like we talked about just now, not having a good retention strategy, identifying those critical employees and making sure you have that plan in place. And I guess the final mistake I'd mention is that I think you mentioned this one before, assuming that we have the right leadership in place without any sort of capabilities assessment. This might be one of the biggest risks we see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You still hit on a lot of different things there. And, we talked about leadership, we talked about talent, communication. You kind of came back to leadership there, a little bit. But, outside of the financial, metrics and the business itself, right, there's so many other things that go into that can kind of lend itself into that common pitfall category. So, Stevens, can you hit on kind of, what does a successful deal actually look like?
Yep. Sure. Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but the answer is probably it depends. And what I mean by that is success criteria will be unique for each deal. So you should be measuring against, your original goals. So I guess the question is, have you realized the value that you laid out in the investment thesis? In other words, you decided that this acquisition or joint venture or investment would make your company more valuable. So did you identify the concrete benefit? And if so, the success should be pretty easy to measure. So we worked with a PE group that bought a manufacturing company, knowing that there were some opportunities to improve the business. They had pretty poor on-time delivery metrics and low overall equipment effectiveness. And so they hired us to transform the operations to help execute against their vision. And we were able to improve equipment performance, enabling some workforce right sizing. We improved on-time delivery, which generated more demand from existing customers. And there may be some new criteria for what success looks like in our current environment. I mean, for instance, companies may need to place more scrutiny on supply chain resiliency than they did before. And maybe part of your post-close plan entails actions to improve that resiliency. You want to identify alternate suppliers. You may want to improve visibility into your supply chain. You may want to even plan collaboratively with your suppliers and your customers. So.
Yeah, Stephen, that's good stuff. I am going to wrap it up from here, but do you have any parting shots for the audience?
I guess I would just say, too often we see companies sort of write off these M&A and other strategies entirely because it's risky or it will take a significant investment. So, maybe the cash outlay for an acquisition isn't right for your company, but the market opportunity is still there possibly. So have you considered a joint venture? I mean, you could formally partner with someone to add that capability without having to take on the full burden of risk for yourself. There's often a lower commitment, and you can also use it strategically for a temporary arrangement. In a recent case study I read, there were 2 metal manufacturing companies that formed a joint venture to build and operate an integrated mill together. So company A focused on converting ore and producing iron products, while B operated as an ore extractor. And so through the joint venture, company A got a guaranteed supply of ore and mitigated the risk of volatile ore prices. And then company B received sort of this guaranteed market and price for its ore. So those type of things can be used, and they could be the benefit of both parties. So, I guess ultimately, I would think the message is companies can be creative in thinking about it as a tool to leverage, and these tools should really be considered as part of strategic planning.
Yes, Stephen, really appreciate the insights and the perspective. Thank you to the viewers and our listeners. We are always open to engagement and dialogue to discuss ways we can help you capitalize on opportunities and or deal with the challenges you are facing. With that, we will go ahead and sign off.
Thanks, Brett.